The morning I was blamed for damaged goods that would cost me everything, I knew someone was lying. I just didn't know it would be the warehouse manager running $1 million insurance scam. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as I stood in the shipping bay, staring at the wreckage of what should have been a routine delivery. 43 cases of premium electronics, each worth more than my monthly salary, scattered across the concrete floor like broken promises. The boxes themselves told the story. Clean tears along the seams, too precise to be accidental damage, too deliberate to be my fault. Marcus Webb, the warehouse manager, circled the destruction like a vulture sizing up carrion. His polished dress shoes clicked against the concrete with each measured step, and I caught the slight upturn at the corner of his mouth when he thought no one was watching. The insurance adjuster scribbled notes on his clipboard, nodding at Webb's animated gestures toward the damaged goods. My hands trembled as I held the delivery manifest, the paper crinkling between my fingers. Every signature was mine, every timestamp matched my route logs perfectly. According to the documentation, I had signed for intact merchandise less than 6 hours ago. But the evidence before me painted a different picture, one that would end my career and drain my savings in legal fees. Webb's assistant, a nervous young woman named Sarah, kept glancing between the damaged goods and her tablet. Her fingers moved across the screen with practiced efficiency, but I noticed how she avoided looking directly at the mess. When Webb approached her, she stepped back instinctively, her shoulders tensing as he leaned over to examine her work. The insurance adjuster raised his hand, signaling for attention. His gray suit was impeccable, his expression neutral as he surveyed the scene. Webb moved to his side immediately, pointing at specific boxes while shaking his head with what appeared to be genuine disappointment. The adjuster's pen moved across his forms, and I knew my fate was being decided in real time. I approached the damaged goods slowly, my steel-toed boots echoing in the cavernous warehouse. The boxes weren't just torn, they were surgically opened, each one displaying the same pattern of damage. The adhesive on the tape showed residue patterns that suggested careful removal and reapplication. My years of handling freight had taught me to recognize the signs of tampering, and these boxes screamed manipulation. Webb noticed my examination and moved closer, his presence looming over me like a shadow. His cologne was expensive, a sharp contrast to the industrial smell of the warehouse. He gestured toward the damaged goods with both hands, his expression a masterpiece of feigned concern and barely contained anger. The adjuster finished his preliminary assessment and approached me directly. His questions came rapid fire, each one designed to establish my responsibility for the damage. I answered truthfully, but I could see skepticism growing in his eyes with each response. Webb stood nearby, occasionally nodding or shaking his head to emphasize points that supported his narrative. By noon, the verdict was clear. The insurance company would investigate, but preliminary findings suggested driver negligence. Webb's documentation was thorough, his witness statements compelling, and his reputation in the industry was spotless. I was a mid-level driver with no history of such incidents, but that only made me a more convenient scapegoat. The termination meeting took place in Webb's office, a glass-walled space that overlooked the warehouse floor. Human Resources had sent their most experienced representative, a woman who had clearly handled similar situations before. She read from a prepared statement while Webb sat behind his desk, his fingers steepled in front of him like a judge pronouncing sentence. My employment was terminated immediately. The company would cooperate fully with the insurance investigation, and any evidence of gross negligence would be forwarded to their legal department. I was escorted from the building within the hour, my personal belongings hastily stuffed into a cardboard box that seemed to mock the severity of my situation. The parking lot felt different as I walked to my car, the asphalt somehow less solid beneath my feet. Other drivers watched from the loading dock, their faces a mixture of sympathy and relief that it wasn't them facing this catastrophe. I had worked with these people for 3 years, but now I was radioactive, a reminder of how quickly everything could fall apart. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing every detail of the day. The damaged goods, Webb's behavior, the insurance adjuster's questions. Something didn't align. I had handled hundreds of similar deliveries without incident, and the pattern of damage was too consistent to be accidental. My instincts, honed by years of navigating corporate politics and warehouse dynamics, told me I was missing something crucial. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my photos from the delivery. Standard procedure required documentation of any anomalies, and I had photographed the goods upon receipt. The timestamps showed everything in perfect condition when I signed for them. But proving my innocence would require more than just my word against Webb's established reputation. Sleep came fitfully that night, interrupted by scenarios of financial ruin and career destruction. But between the anxiety and frustration, a different emotion began to crystallize. Cold, calculating anger. Someone had orchestrated this situation with precision, and I was the intended casualty. The question was no longer whether I was innocent, but how I would prove it. The next morning brought a call from the insurance company. Their investigator wanted to meet, and his tone suggested the preliminary findings were not encouraging. I agreed to the meeting, but as I hung up, I realized I needed to conduct my own investigation. If Webb was orchestrating this situation, there would be evidence. I just had to find it. I started with the basics, researching Consolidated Freight's insurance history and claims patterns. Public records showed a concerning trend. Damaged goods claims had increased by 300% over the past 18 months, all processed through Webb's warehouse. The monetary value of these claims totaled nearly $2 million, and the pattern of damage was remarkably consistent across different incidents. Each claim followed the same blueprint: goods damaged during transport, driver negligence established through documentation, insurance payouts processed efficiently. The drivers involved were all terminated, their careers effectively ended by the incident. None had successfully challenged the findings, and most had quietly accepted their fate rather than face prolonged legal battles. Webb's signature appeared on every claim form, his statements consistently supporting the negligence narrative. But more interesting was the pattern of his career advancement. Each promotion coincided with a spike in successful insurance claims. His rise through the company hierarchy was directly correlated with his ability to generate profitable insurance settlements. I began mapping the timeline of incidents, cross-referencing them with Webb's work schedule and the rotation of drivers. The pattern was elegant in its simplicity. High-value shipments were assigned to expendable drivers, damaged under controlled conditions, and processed through insurance channels that Webb had clearly cultivated. The drivers became convenient scapegoats, their terminations preventing any long-term scrutiny of the operation. The insurance adjuster I had met was named Robert Chen, and his involvement in multiple claims raised additional questions. His preliminary assessments consistently favored Webb's version of events, and his reports were remarkably similar in structure and conclusion. Professional connections between Chen and Webb were worth investigating, but that would require resources I didn't currently possess. I needed evidence, but accessing the warehouse was impossible after my termination. However, I remembered Sarah's nervous behavior during the incident. Her reaction to Webb's proximity suggested fear rather than respect, and her careful avoidance of eye contact indicated she knew more than she was revealing. She might be my only link to the inside information I needed. Finding Sarah outside of work required some creative social media research. Her Instagram showed a pattern of activities that included a regular Thursday evening yoga class at a studio downtown. The class ended at 8 p.m., and the studio was in a shopping complex with several coffee shops nearby. It was worth a chance. Thursday evening came with unseasonable cold, the kind that made people hurry between buildings without lingering. I positioned myself at a coffee shop across from the yoga studio, nursing a black coffee and watching the entrance. At 8:15, Sarah emerged with two other women, all carrying yoga mats and chatting animatedly about their instructor's challenging routine. She separated from the group near the parking garage, and I approached her carefully. Her initial reaction was startled recognition, then concern when she realized I was no longer employed at the warehouse. But as I explained my situation, something in her expression shifted. Not surprise, but the relief of someone who had been waiting for this conversation. Sarah's apartment was a modest one-bedroom in a complex that catered to young professionals. Her nervousness was palpable as she unlocked the door, checking over her shoulder multiple times as if expecting surveillance. Once inside, she moved to the windows and closed the blinds with deliberate precision. She offered coffee, but her hands shook as she prepared it. The kitchen was immaculate, almost sterile in its organization. Everything had a place, and everything was in its place, except for a manila folder on the counter that she quickly moved to a drawer when she noticed my attention. We sat at her small dining table, and I laid out my theory about the insurance scam. Sarah's reaction was immediate and telling. Her face went pale, and she gripped her coffee mug with both hands, as if it were anchoring her to reality. She didn't deny my accusations, but she didn't confirm them either. Instead, she stared into her coffee like it contained answers she was afraid to voice. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken knowledge. I could see the internal struggle playing out across her features, the desire to reveal the truth warring with fear of the consequences. Finally, she stood and retrieved the manila folder from the drawer, placing it on the table between us like a bridge across a chasm. The folder contained photocopies of internal memos, shipping manifests, and insurance claim forms. The documents painted a picture of systematic fraud that was breathtaking in its scope and audacity. Webb had been running the scam for over 2 years, generating false claims worth millions of dollars through a network of corrupted insurance adjusters and complicit warehouse staff. Sarah's role had been data management, ensuring that digital records supported the false narratives while maintaining plausible deniability. She had been documenting everything, initially for her own protection, but increasingly as evidence of crimes she could no longer ignore. Her folder contained enough material to destroy Webb's operation and send him to prison for decades. The insurance payouts were structured to avoid triggering federal investigations, keeping individual claims below thresholds that would require extensive scrutiny. But the cumulative effect was massive. Nearly $3 million in fraudulent claims over 24 months, all processed through Webb's carefully constructed network. Chen, the insurance adjuster, was receiving kickbacks for expedited claim processing and favorable preliminary assessments. His reports consistently supported Webb's narratives, and his investigations were deliberately superficial. The relationship between them was documented in a series of emails Sarah had printed, showing payment schedules and operational protocols. The drivers who had been terminated were collateral damage, their careers destroyed to maintain the illusion of legitimate claims. Webb had targeted drivers with clean records but limited resources, knowing they would be unlikely to mount effective legal challenges. The termination served a dual purpose: eliminating witnesses and creating a paper trail that supported the negligence narrative. Sarah's fear was justified. Webb's operation had generated enough money to fund extensive countermeasures against exposure. She had witnessed the termination of a previous warehouse employee who had asked too many questions, and she was convinced that Webb would use any means necessary to protect his scheme. But her documentation was meticulous, and her position in the data management system had given her access to information that would be devastating in the right hands. She had been waiting for someone with sufficient motivation to use the evidence effectively, and my situation provided the perfect opportunity. I left Sarah's apartment with copies of everything, my mind racing with possibilities. The evidence was overwhelming, but using it effectively would require careful planning. Webb's operation was sophisticated, and his response to exposure would be swift and merciless. I needed to orchestrate a revelation that would be impossible to suppress or redirect. The next morning, I began researching federal agencies that investigated insurance fraud. The FBI had a specialized unit that handled cases involving interstate commerce, and their success rate with documented evidence was impressive. But federal investigations moved slowly, and Webb would have months to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. I needed a more immediate solution, something that would expose the fraud publicly while providing protection for Sarah and other potential witnesses. The local news media had investigative reporters who specialized in corporate corruption, and their timelines were more aggressive than federal agencies. Jennifer Morrison from Channel 7 News had built a reputation for exposing corporate fraud through meticulous investigation and compelling storytelling. Her recent series on municipal corruption had resulted in 3 indictments and a Pulitzer Prize nomination. She was exactly the kind of journalist who would appreciate the magnitude of Webb's operation. I called the station and requested a meeting with Morrison, explaining that I had evidence of a multi-million-dollar insurance fraud scheme. Her assistant was initially skeptical, but when I mentioned the dollar amounts and the duration of the operation, she agreed to arrange a preliminary meeting. Morrison's office was a testament to investigative journalism. Whiteboards covered with timelines and connection maps, filing cabinets overflowing with documents, and multiple computer monitors displaying research materials. She was younger than I had expected, but her intensity was immediately apparent in the way she absorbed information and asked probing questions. I presented the evidence methodically, explaining Webb's operation and the role of corrupted insurance adjusters. Morrison's interest intensified as I described the systematic termination of drivers and the sophisticated documentation that supported false claims. She took extensive notes, asking for clarification on technical details and requesting copies of key documents. Her preliminary assessment was encouraging. The evidence was sufficient to support a comprehensive investigation, and the story had elements that would captivate television audiences. But she warned that exposing the fraud would require protecting sources and building an ironclad case that could withstand legal challenges. Morrison's investigation would take several weeks, during which time I would need to maintain a low profile while gathering additional evidence. She provided me with a secure communication method and emphasized the importance of avoiding any contact with Webb or his associates that might alert them to our activities. Over the following days, I conducted surveillance of Webb's routine, documenting his movements and identifying potential vulnerabilities in his operation. His confidence was evident in his predictable schedule and lack of security precautions. He genuinely believed his scheme was undetectable, and his arrogance would be his downfall. Webb's office overlooked the warehouse floor, and I could observe his daily activities from a parking structure across the street. He arrived each morning at 7:30 a.m., checked his computer for overnight developments, and spent the first hour reviewing shipping manifests and insurance documentation. His routine was clockwork precise, a testament to the systematic nature of his fraud. The warehouse operated on 3 shifts, with the highest value shipments processed during the day shift when Webb was present to oversee operations. The night shift handled routine freight, while the evening shift focused on documentation and administrative tasks. The timing suggested that Webb's fraud required his direct involvement, limiting the operation to specific hours when he could maintain control. I began mapping the relationships between warehouse staff, identifying employees who might have knowledge of the fraud or who could provide additional evidence. Several drivers had been terminated under suspicious circumstances, and their testimonies could corroborate the pattern of systematic fraud. Tom Bradley had been terminated 6 months earlier for allegedly damaging a shipment of computer equipment. His termination followed the same pattern as mine: immediate dismissal, insurance claim, and career destruction. But Tom had been a 20-year veteran with an impeccable record, making his alleged negligence highly suspicious. I tracked down Tom through mutual contacts in the trucking industry. He was working for a smaller company at significantly reduced wages, his reputation tarnished by the incident at Consolidated Freight. His bitterness was palpable when I explained my situation, and his willingness to cooperate was immediate and enthusiastic. Tom's story was eerily similar to mine: high-value shipment, suspicious damage, immediate termination. But he had kept detailed records of his delivery, including photographs and GPS tracking data that contradicted Webb's narrative. His evidence had been dismissed during the insurance investigation, but it would be invaluable for establishing the pattern of fraud. Marcus Rivera had been terminated 8 months earlier under similar circumstances. His incident involved damaged pharmaceutical supplies worth over $200,000, and his termination had been particularly swift. Marcus had attempted to challenge the findings, but lacked the resources for a prolonged legal battle. I found Marcus working construction. His trucking career effectively ended by the incident at Consolidated Freight. His anger was fresh despite the passage of time, and his memory of the incident was detailed and precise. Like Tom, he had maintained documentation that contradicted the official narrative. The pattern was clear. Webb had systematically targeted experienced drivers with clean records, using their terminations to support false insurance claims. The drivers' reputations and careers were sacrificed to maintain the illusion of legitimate claims processing. Morrison's investigation was progressing rapidly, aided by the evidence I had provided and the testimonies of terminated drivers. She had identified additional warehouse employees who were willing to cooperate, and her research had uncovered financial connections between Webb and several insurance adjusters. The breakthrough came when Morrison's financial analyst discovered a series of offshore accounts linked to Webb's operation. The accounts contained deposits that corresponded perfectly with insurance payouts, providing irrefutable evidence of the fraud. The sophistication of the money laundering suggested involvement by professional criminals, elevating the investigation to federal jurisdiction. Morrison scheduled the expose for the following Thursday, allowing time for final verification and legal review. The story would air during prime time, ensuring maximum exposure for Webb's crimes. But the timing also meant that Webb would have several days to respond once the investigation became public. I spent the weekend preparing for the aftermath of the expose. Webb's response would be swift and potentially dangerous, and I needed to be ready for legal challenges, media attention, and possible retaliation. Morrison had arranged for witness protection protocols, but the situation remained volatile. Tuesday morning brought an unexpected development. Sarah called in a panic, reporting that Webb was conducting an intensive audit of all warehouse documentation. He was working late hours, reviewing files and questioning employees about their knowledge of operational procedures. Her fear was that he had discovered the missing documents and was preparing countermeasures. I met Sarah at a coffee shop near her apartment, and her anxiety was immediately apparent. She had been working under increased scrutiny, with Webb monitoring her activities and questioning her about missing files. Her access to sensitive documents had been restricted, and she was convinced that her role in the investigation had been discovered. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. Webb's audit was clearly designed to identify and eliminate evidence of his fraud, and Sarah's position was becoming increasingly precarious. Morrison's investigation was nearly complete, but Webb's countermeasures threatened to undermine the entire operation. I called Morrison immediately, explaining the developing situation and the threat to our primary source. Her response was swift. The investigation timeline would be accelerated, with the story airing Wednesday evening instead of Thursday. The rush schedule was risky, but the alternative was allowing Webb to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. Tuesday evening was spent in final preparations. Morrison conducted last-minute interviews with key sources, while I reviewed my testimony and prepared for the media attention that would follow. The story would end Webb's career and likely result in federal charges, but it would also expose me to potential retaliation. Sarah's situation was particularly dangerous. As an internal source, she would be Webb's primary target for retaliation. Morrison had arranged for her to be interviewed remotely, with her identity protected through voice alteration and visual obscuration. But her continued employment at the warehouse was impossible after the story aired. Wednesday morning brought news that Webb had called in sick, breaking his routine for the first time in months. His absence suggested either illness or preparation for the coming exposure. The warehouse was operating under the supervision of his assistant manager, but the atmosphere was tense and uncertain. I positioned myself in the parking structure across from the warehouse, watching for any unusual activity. Webb's car was not in its usual space, and several vehicles I didn't recognize were parked near the administrative building. The presence of unknown individuals suggested that Webb was assembling his response team. Morrison's final interview was scheduled for 2 p.m., and I met her at the television station to review the story structure and confirm key details. The investigation was comprehensive, with multiple sources confirming Webb's fraud and extensive documentation supporting every allegation. The story would air at 6 p.m., giving Webb minimal time to respond. The interview was conducted in a secure studio, with Morrison asking pointed questions about my experience and the evidence I had uncovered. My responses were measured and factual, focusing on the systematic nature of Webb's fraud and the impact on innocent drivers. The interview would serve as the foundation for the entire investigation. As 6 p.m. approached, I felt a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. The story would vindicate my innocence and expose Webb's crimes, but it would also thrust me into the center of a media storm. The consequences would be far-reaching, affecting not only Webb and his co-conspirators, but also the entire freight industry's insurance practices. Morrison's story was devastating in its thoroughness and impact. She presented the evidence methodically, building a comprehensive case that left no doubt about Webb's guilt. The financial analysis was particularly damning, showing the flow of money from fraudulent claims to Webb's personal accounts. The interviews with terminated drivers were compelling, each one describing identical patterns of suspicious damage and immediate termination. The consistency of their experiences made Webb's fraud undeniable, and their personal stories provided emotional weight to the financial evidence. Sarah's testimony was particularly powerful, her insider knowledge providing details that would have been impossible to obtain through external investigation. Her description of Webb's methods and the involvement of corrupted insurance adjusters painted a picture of a systematic criminal enterprise that operated with impunity for years. The story concluded with Morrison's analysis of the broader implications, noting that Webb's fraud had cost insurance companies millions of dollars while destroying the careers of innocent drivers. The investigation would likely result in federal charges and a comprehensive review of industry practices. Webb's response was immediate and predictable. Within hours of the broadcast, his attorney issued a statement denying all allegations and threatening legal action against the television station. The statement characterized the story as a vindictive attack by a disgruntled former employee, attempting to shift focus from the evidence to my motivations. But the evidence was overwhelming, and Webb's denials were hollow in the face of documented proof. The financial records in particular were irrefutable evidence of his criminal activity. His attorney's threats were empty posturing designed to create doubt rather than address the substance of the allegations. The FBI's response was swift and decisive. Within 24 hours of the broadcast, federal agents were executing search warrants at Webb's home, office, and the warehouse facility. The raids were coordinated to prevent destruction of evidence, and the scope of the investigation expanded to include Webb's network of co-conspirators. Webb's arrest came Thursday morning as he attempted to access his office despite the ongoing federal investigation. The charges were extensive: mail fraud, wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit insurance fraud. The cumulative potential sentences totaled over 30 years in federal prison. Chen, the corrupted insurance adjuster, was arrested simultaneously at his office. His cooperation with Webb's fraud was thoroughly documented, and his financial records showed receipt of kickbacks totaling over $400,000. His professional reputation was destroyed, and his insurance license was immediately suspended. The warehouse was shut down pending the federal investigation, and dozens of employees were interviewed about their knowledge of Webb's activities. Several additional arrests were expected as the investigation expanded to include other members of the fraud network. Sarah's decision to cooperate with the investigation was vindicated by the arrests and the comprehensive nature of the evidence. Her insider knowledge had been crucial to understanding Webb's methods, and her courage in coming forward had made justice possible. The witness protection protocols ensured her safety during the investigation and prosecution. The terminated drivers, including Tom, Marcus, and myself, were cleared of all allegations related to damaged goods. The insurance companies were forced to reverse their findings and restore our employment eligibility. The vindication was complete, but the damage to our careers and reputations would take time to repair. Morrison's investigation earned her a second Pulitzer Prize nomination and established her as one of the nation's leading investigative journalists. Her methodical approach and compelling storytelling had exposed a criminal enterprise that might have operated indefinitely without her intervention. The broader implications of Webb's fraud extended throughout the freight industry. Insurance companies implemented new verification procedures, and warehouse operations were subjected to increased scrutiny. The systematic nature of Webb's crimes had revealed vulnerabilities that affected the entire industry. Webb's trial was scheduled for the following year, but his conviction was virtually certain given the overwhelming evidence. His attorney's strategy focused on minimizing his sentence rather than challenging his guilt, and plea negotiations were expected to begin within weeks. The financial restitution would be substantial, with Webb's assets seized to compensate the insurance companies and affected drivers. His offshore accounts were frozen, and his luxury lifestyle was dismantled piece by piece. The man who had orchestrated a multi-million-dollar fraud was reduced to a federal defendant facing decades in prison. Sarah's testimony before the grand jury was sealed, but her cooperation earned her immunity from prosecution and a new job with a private investigation firm. Her skills in data analysis and her experience with corporate fraud made her valuable to organizations seeking to prevent similar crimes. The warehouse eventually reopened under new management, with enhanced security procedures and transparent operational protocols. Webb's replacement implemented systems designed to prevent fraud, and the facility became a model for ethical freight operations. 6 months after the expose, I was working for a premium freight company at a salary significantly higher than my previous position. My reputation had been not only restored, but enhanced by my role in exposing Webb's fraud. The ordeal had transformed me from a victim into a symbol of justice and perseverance. The final hearing was held on a cold Tuesday morning in federal court. Webb appeared in shackles, his once confident demeanor replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had lost everything. His sentencing was scheduled for the following month, but the outcome was predetermined by the magnitude of his crimes. As I watched Webb led away by federal marshals, I felt the cold satisfaction of justice served. The man who had orchestrated my professional destruction was facing the consequences of his actions, and his victims had been vindicated. The insurance scam that had seemed so sophisticated and undetectable had been exposed and dismantled. The warehouse floor where my ordeal had begun was now empty. The site of Webb's crimes transformed into a memorial to the importance of integrity in business operations. The damaged goods that had started my investigation were long gone, but their legacy lived on in the justice that had been served. Webb's sentence was 25 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15 years. The judge's comments focused on the systematic nature of his crimes and the impact on innocent victims. Justice had been served, and the chapter of my life defined by his fraud had finally closed. Standing in the parking lot where I had once faced professional destruction, I felt the weight of vindication settle over me like a cloak. The man who had tried to destroy me was now facing the consequences of his actions, and his sophisticated fraud had been exposed for what it truly was: a criminal enterprise built on the destruction of innocent lives. The warehouse manager's insurance scam was over, but its impact would resonate throughout the industry for years to come. The drivers who had been terminated, the companies that had been defrauded, and the system that had been corrupted would all bear the scars of Webb's greed. But justice had been served, and that was enough.